Hey everybody, what's up? You can see the title below, and you can pretty much see what it is. Hold on, I'm trying to make sure my camera's in the right direction here. Yeah, it is. But you're probably seeing it down below. It says legacy. Now, what is legacy, if you must ask? What is legacy, basically? What is it? Well, a legacy is doing something that people will remember for quite some time. A legacy is doing things that people will talk about for years. Let's say in professional wrestling, which I'm a fan of. You got guys like Hulk Hogan, the late Macho Man Randy Savage, Ultimate Warrior. Guys that have done things in the wrestling business and now that are basically in, well, Savage, God rest his soul, is up in heaven. But you got guys like Warrior and Hogan who are basically retired. At times will come out of retirement maybe for a match here and there. But basically you got them retired but still contributing. You got guys like Stone Cold Steve Austin, who was forced into retirement, but could make a comeback. You got guys like Adam Copeland, Edge. And you take a look at the resume of what they had done in the business, and you look at what they have accomplished, the championships they won, the moments they were a part of, the errors they were a part of. And you could see the legacy they left behind. You could see and hear people talking about what Austin did during his career, the moments he did, the championships he won. The same with Edge. You hear people talking about what he had done during his career, the moments he had, the championships he won and how he won them. And the same with Austin. Heck, you take a look at Edge, and one of the things that sticks out to people is when he did that spear off the ladder onto Jeff Hardy at WrestleMania 17, still fresh in my mind. Take a look at Hogan. Hogan did the NWO, 1996. That's still fresh in people's minds. These are things that are part of legacies that get people talking and still talking to this very day. Then you take a look at the comic book industry, and if not the movie industry, and there's a lot of directors and writers and all that. They have written and directed movies and written comic book stories and all that have defined their legacy. They have defined who they were or who they are. You take a look at Ken Penders, controversial or not. The guy, when he was with Archie Comics, you have to admit, during his early portion, did a great job. And one of his standout stories or story arcs was Endgame. And that right there, you take a look at everything else he did before, and you take a look at everything he did afterwards, and the one defining story arc, the one defining moment of his legacy on the Sonic comic book would be Endgame. Will be and is Endgame. Pretty much everybody knows that. Pretty much everybody knows that. And, again, you take a look at other comic book companies, like you take a look at, let's say, Marvel, for example. A lot of defining moments and legacies were created there. Same with DC. You take a look at DC. They've had a lot of defining moments and legacies created there. The Doomsday arc is a good example as well. Dark Knight Returns, which has been adapted into the first ever DC Animated Universe 2-part movie. Basically, 1 part and 2 parts. So you know what I mean? That defined a legacy. Things like that. But then you take a look at those that wrote those comics, wrote those story arcs, and you say that these moments, these story arcs, didn't just define the legacy of the comic book and the comic book character itself, but it defined the legacy of the people that wrote it, that were associated with it. And the same could be said for Ian Flynn. See, Ian Flynn last year basically stated that his current story arc his current story arc, which is the Mecha Sally Death Egg Mark II World Tour 2 story arc, was going to be double the length of the Iron Dominion arc. You know, when he said it was going to be double the length, pretty much a lot of people had it figured that it would be about almost 2 years worth, or at least near 2 years worth. Because when you think about it, it started at the end of 230. It started at the end of 230, and really took off from there. Sure, it had its mishaps, its distractions, and all that for the past year or so. But it essentially has been doing exactly what Ian Flynn has been wanting it to do. Hold on for a second while I put this bird in another room. Hold on, folks. Just making sure so. But anyway, when you take a look, like I was saying, at, at the time that it started, at the end of 230, but officially got started with 231, if not 232, as some people like to look at it, but mostly 231, then it definitely lives up to what Ian Flynn has been saying. It's double the length of the Iron Dominion, because when you take a look at the Iron Dominion, and I mentioned this in a two-part video about how the current arc right now could have been done, I basically say that the Iron Dominion arc, with the addition of the Journey to the East subplot and universe, is basically over a year long. So, in other words, it's supposed to double the length of the main portion of that story arc in the main comic, and that's exactly what it's doing. And sometimes when a writer does that, and believe me, Ian Flynn is not the first. Ian Flynn is not the first to do a story arc that long. He's not the first to do a story arc that long in any comic book. He's not the first to do a story arc that long in any comic book. I mean, heck, when Archie Comics had the Ninja Turtles license to do the Ninja Turtle Adventure comics, there were several times that they did story arcs just as long as this one. And sometimes they may have not made sense in connecting with each other from issue to issue, but still they had story arcs that long. Now, the thing is though, like I was saying, it's not the first time somebody does this. You look at Marvel, you look at DC, like I mentioned earlier, and they have had story arcs that whether or not they've been, whether the story arc's been isolated to just one issue, to one comic, or it's been spread about, they have basically done double the same, double of length in story arc that Ian Flynn is doing right now. Now, is this all because Ian Flynn wants to defy his legacy? Well, let's take a look at what VK, I'm going to call him VK if you will, has to say about this. VK basically has to say this. VK basically has to say this. Hold on for a minute, folks. I gotta make sure my dog doesn't scratch that window again. Okay, and I may have to do this in two parts, so I apologize. Check the time here. Yeah, I'm probably going to do this in two parts. But anyway, like I was saying, VK, as I like to call him, DeviantArt did this one day ago, and one day, 5 hours ago. And it's basically in a response to my video that I'd done before. And you can find that here on YouTube. Several of them, anyway, 2 of them most recently. And it's basically where I talked about how this defies his legacy and all that, and how whether or not he likes what's going on and stuff like that, as well as the update. So you can, again, check that out here on this channel. But again, this is what he says. This is what VK had to say a couple, basically 24 hours ago, actually 28 hours ago, if you will. This is what he says, and again, I'm probably going to be doing this in 2 parts. This is what he said, and I quote, "So this was inspired by BVW1979, which is my name on DeviantArt, my username on DeviantArt. Okay, so this was inspired by BVW's response to my last little shot at the comics, that being to link me to a pre-existing video in which he explained the motive Flynn has for doing this, and whether he wants to push back his story or not. He basically said that Flynn's hand is forced into it by Sega and Capcom, and he's dragging out the story arc so that when people think of the comics, they'll think of quote unquote that 2-year-long thing with Mecha Sally. He wants to leave his mark by making a story that's double the length of the Iron Dominion, and instead of saying arc, he says mess. Yeah, he calls it a mess. Regardless of whether the plot chosen was regardless of whether the plot chosen has what's needed to last that long, which from the filler, the padding, and the 5 months worth of delays, it doesn't. I gotta sit with my dog once. She probably sees a cat or something, I don't know. I can't help it. It's like every time I do a video, it's like she's gotta let me out. I don't know. But anyway, basically this is what he said, getting back to his, okay, basically, before I was interrupted there, folks, I apologize. He says, basically this will continue on, and this is what VK says, and I quote, he basically said, that Flynn's hand was forced into it by Sega and Capcom, and he's dragging out the story arc so that when people think of the comics, they'll think of that quote-unquote 2-year-long thing with Mecha Sally. He wants to leave his mark by making a story that's double the length of the Iron Dominion arc, or as he calls it, mess, regardless of whether the plot chosen has what's needed to last that long, which from the filler, the padding, and 5 months worth of delays, it doesn't. Now continuing on, this is what he says. Funny, I really doubt it would matter all that much if, quote-unquote, at all costs, got finished before the crossover started. Or maybe it would have been done by now if they hadn't repeated the story structure for 3 issues, running from 236 to 239, basically consisting of, quote-unquote, heroes find Sally, one hero fights Sally, hero beats Sally, Sally still escapes for reasons that only make sense when explained in Cybertronian. Or maybe if the plot hadn't been diverted for endangered species, and its villain that looks like the result of a drunken tristis between the Werehog and Linda, especially when it makes Knuckles look like an asshole who will only get involved in the situation if it threatens the echidna, and not when his actual friends need his help. Excuse me while I check my time here. I'm going to have to do this in 2 parts, folks, so hold on.